The main reason why we are covering both Ruskin and Pater at the same time is that they were both examples during the Victorian period of a new sort of intellectual, that of the professor of art and art history. Their longtime association for both of them with Oxford University. Both of them also share unique features in common, as you will notice from your readings today. And in addition to their achievements in writing about the history of art, they are also held up as exemplars of Victorian prose and also a Victorian style of intellectual inquiry. They both each covered an enormous range of topics in their writing. For Ruskin, writing about Renaissance and medieval art and architecture, but also contemporary art and architecture. And Pater, in addition to writing about the same sorts of subjects, also wrote about classical philosophy and was made later on a professor of classics at Oxford. Ruskin is also famous for his championing of artists such as J.M.W. Turner. A great deal has been written about their relationship, and the derivative works which are constructed around their relationship include such things as the recent film by Mike Leigh, simply entitled, which references their relationship in addition to chronicling the latter years of Turner's life. In works such as Modern Painters, Ruskin, in essence, taught the British public how to understand Turner's painting, among others, and to also see that color and not line were the organizing characteristics of painting. Later on, a similar sort of logic would be used in order to create a critical vocabulary for understanding French Impressionism. But for our purposes today, you can see how Ruskin's attention to contemporary painting and its departure from realism enabled him to establish different criteria for the greatness of medieval and also Renaissance art. This is an attitude that is on evidence in the conclusion of Stones of Venice, which has been assigned for today. In the section that begins with paragraph 12 and extends on to paragraph 16, we find this description of the olive tree as one finds it in the mosaic decorating the cupola at St. Mark's in Venice. Ruskin spends a great deal of time talking specifically about the olive tree, the way in which his imaginary medieval craftsman would conceive of designing an olive tree with the spiky leaves and the golden olives and looking recognizably like an olive tree, separating, as you can see in the illustration, each of the 12 apostles from the other, while at the same time reaching the viewer who is standing in the shadows of a rather poorly lit medieval cathedral. Olives are obviously not gold, as they are in the mosaic, but black. Ruskin posits that the viewer knows this full well. However, they accept this departure from realism because they understand, in essence, the holiness of the anonymous artist's errand. Ruskin lays a great deal of weight and value on the concept of anonymity in medieval art and architecture. This is the principle that allows Ruskin to assign value to something that is not necessarily an expression of a unique and individual genius, but it is through the imperfection of the work that one comes to understand the soul of the craftsperson who created it, with all of the rough edges and bad angles and blown perspectives and things like that. You can also see in Ruskin a kind of leftover from Wordsworthian Romanticism, in that the greatness of the artist lies within the greatness of the soul of the artist and not necessarily the perfection of the work. At the beginning of paragraph 6, Ruskin says, quote, "Here, therefore, let me finally and firmly enunciate the great principle to which all that has hitherto been stated is subservient, that art is valuable or otherwise only as it expresses the personality, activity, and living perception of a good and great human soul, that it may express and contain this with little help from execution and less from science, and that if have not this, if it show not the vigor, perception, and invention of a mighty human spirit, it is worthless. Ruskin is someone with whom we can credit the rescuing and recovery of an entire era of especially medieval art, Romanesque architecture, Norman architecture, and the Gothic. A great deal of this is also in evidence with Ruskin, as we see in the conclusion to the Renaissance most especially, which one can take as an intertext with the picture of Dorian Gray, and I believe it speaks for itself in a fairly strong way. Pater, having taken up the same professorship that Ruskin resigned, that it underscores a continuity between them of thought. We see this kind of thing, this sort of approach to someone who has been held up as the Western paradigm of a person of genius, Leonardo da Vinci, and the way that Pater tackles this appreciation of Leonardo's art goes into great depth, into great psychological speculation as to the sort of person that Leonardo was like. The entirety of the chapter that Pater devotes to Leonardo is interesting, but I would like to look in particular at the page 122. You can see the page references in the brackets very near the end of the chapter, where he talks about the subjects of Leonardo's art, speculates on the relationship between the subject and Leonardo, and then the paragraph beginning here, where he rhapsodizes about the later works of Leonardo, is interesting in that there's no way that any contemporary art critic would be able to get away with such puffery, in short. Quote, "The remaining years of Leonardo's life were more or less years of wandering. From his brilliant life at court he had saved nothing, and he returned to Florence a poor man. Perhaps necessity kept his spirit excited. The next 4 years are one prolonged rapture or ecstasy of invention. He painted now the pictures of the Louvre, his most authentic works, which came there straight from the cabinet of Francis I at Fontainebleau," and so on. Further on down the page, he talks about, when he references La Gioconda, he's talking about the Mona Lisa depicted here, where he begins to describe the painting, but doesn't go through it really feature by feature, but rather, again, goes into the psychology, perhaps, of the sitter, which, really is how the painting is viewed popularly. Where he says, "La Gioconda is, in the truest sense, Leonardo's masterpiece, the revealing instance of his mode of thought and work. In suggestiveness, only the melancholy of Durer is comparable to it, and no crude symbolism disturbs the effect of its subdued and graceful mystery. We all know the face and hands of the figure set in its marble chair in that circle of fantastic rocks as in some faint light under the sea." And then he goes on and on and on about it, beginning with the next paragraph that begins, "The presence that rose thus so strangely beside the waters is expressive of what in the ways of 1,000 years men had come to desire. Hers is the head upon which all the ends of the world are come, and the eyelids are a little weary. It is a beauty wrought out from within upon the flesh, the deposit little cell by cell of strange thoughts and fantastic reveries and exquisite passions." This is the sort of thing that Eliot is going to come along later, especially in tradition and individual talent, and rail against in talking about the person of Leonardo, talking about the material from which he drew inspiration for his work, and then talking about it in such rapturous terms. This is the sort of thing that Eliot most especially wants to avoid, and is a definite hallmark of the kinds of Victorian art criticism he was no doubt familiar with. And again, despite my modernist inclinations, I want to say that it's not that I don't think that this sort of criticism doesn't have value, but rather I want to understand how Victorians valued their artwork as being an expression most explicitly of artist psychology, where the formal properties of the work are really secondary to everything else. When we get to talk about Eliot, we will get to see how